Budapest, December 24th, 1944. The city was dressed for Christmas. Candles flickered behind frosted windows along Andrassy Avenue. Paper stars hung in stairwells. In churches on both sides of the Danube, Buda and Pest, priests prepared for midnight mass. Families rationed their last pieces of bread, saving a crust or two for tomorrow, because tomorrow was Christmas. At exactly that moment, the city was sealed. By the evening of December 24th, 1944, Soviet forces of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts completed the encirclement of Budapest. German and Hungarian units were trapped inside. So were nearly 800,000 civilians, children, elderly people, entire families who had been told it would never come to this. There was no announcement, no siren that said this is the end. Just the sudden realization that every road out was gone. Budapest had become a fortress. Only hours earlier, Adolf Hitler had declared the city a Festung, a stronghold to be defended at all costs. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was unthinkable. The order applied not just to soldiers, but to the city itself. Budapest was no longer a place where people lived. It was a weapon to be used, and if necessary, destroyed. The bridges across the Danube, the Chain Bridge, Margaret Bridge, Elizabeth Bridge, were wired with explosives. Tram lines stood frozen in place. Trains no longer came. Radios crackled with contradictory rumors. The Soviets were close. The Germans would break through. Help was coming. No one was coming. That night, snow began to fall. For many residents, Christmas Eve meant going underground. Basements filled with families carrying blankets, pots, and icons. Some brought small fir branches, tied together with string to resemble a Christmas tree. Children were told stories in whispers. Mothers pressed fingers to lips, not because the children were loud, but because the city itself had learned to listen for death. Above them, artillery began to speak. The first shells did not strike churches or hospitals. They landed on intersections, rail yards, and military depots, methodical, precise. But every explosion sent a message. This will not stop for Christmas. By midnight, Budapest was fully surrounded. The siege had begun. Elsewhere in Europe, Christmas meant temporary pauses, moments of quiet, or at least the illusion of it. In 1914, soldiers on the Western Front had once laid down their weapons. That story had become legend. Budapest would have no legend like that. Instead, it would have something else. Inside the city were roughly 79,000 German troops and 70,000 Hungarian soldiers, including units loyal to the fascist Arrow Cross Party, men who had already turned the streets into hunting grounds months before the siege. Since October 1944, after the Arrow Cross seized power under Ferenc Szalasi, terror had become routine. Jews were dragged from apartments at night. Forced marches headed west. Executions by the river were no longer shocking. They were expected. What made Christmas different was not the violence itself. It was the timing. On the Pest embankment of the Danube, the river moved dark and slow beneath the winter sky. The water did not freeze completely that year. It carried things away. That night, Arrow Cross militiamen brought groups of civilians, mostly Jews, sometimes entire families, to the riverbank. Their hands were tied, shoes were taken. They were lined up in silence because screams carried far over water. Shots echoed across the river. Bodies fell forward, pulled by gravity and by each other, disappearing into the black current. The Danube did not stop flowing for Christmas. Later, survivors would say that December 24-25 was among the worst nights, not because it was unique, but because it shattered something fundamental. Even the thin hope that holidays still mattered was gone. In Buda, on the western hills, families huddled in wine cellars carved deep into stone. From there, they could hear the city breathing. Explosions like distant thunder, closer now, more frequent. Plaster dust fell like snow from ceilings. Some prayed, some drank, some simply waited. No one knew how long the siege would last. No one knew who would still be alive when it ended. Outside the city, Soviet commanders sent surrender ultimatums into Budapest. German officers rejected them. The answer was final. The battle would be fought house by house, street by street, room by room. Christmas morning arrived without bells. Churches stood open, but few dared to attend. The sound of artillery drowned out hymns. Priests delivered abbreviated sermons to half-empty pews. In some parishes, Mass was held in crypts, the altar lit by candles shaking with each distant blast. In apartments, families exchanged gifts made from nothing. A carved piece of wood, a poem written on scrap paper, a promise to survive. Outside, the city was already bleeding. Budapest did not fall quickly. It would endure 102 days of siege, one of the longest and most destructive urban battles of the Second World War. By the time it ended in February 1945, tens of thousands of civilians would be dead. Entire districts would be rubble. Bridges would lie in the river they once crossed. But it was on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1944, that the city crossed an invisible line. That was the night Budapest learned that there would be no pause, no mercy, no sacred hours, only survival, or the lack of it. This was the beginning of what many would later call the Bloody Christmas of Budapest. In the autumn of 1944, Budapest still believed it had time. The war had been moving closer for months. Everyone knew that. But belief is not built on facts. It is built on habit. And Budapest's habit was survival through avoidance. The city had endured political shifts, occupations, and alliances before. It told itself this would be another storm that passed without striking the heart. That illusion was carefully maintained. Hungary had been an ally of Nazi Germany since 1940. But by 1944, the alliance was rotting from the inside. Regent Miklos Horthy had begun secret negotiations with the Allies, hoping to pull Hungary out of the war before the Red Army reached the capital. When Hitler learned of this, he acted decisively. In March 1944, German forces occupied Hungary outright. The message was clear: Budapest would not be allowed to choose its own fate. By October, Horthy was gone. Power fell into the hands of the Arrow Cross Party, led by Ferenc Szalasi, a fanatical movement that combined Nazi ideology with local extremism. Their rule was short, brutal, and catastrophic. Terror became policy. The city's Jewish population, already stripped of rights, was pushed toward annihilation at a pace that shocked even German officials. And yet, life continued. Trams still ran. Cafes still opened their doors in the mornings. Teachers still gave lessons, though classrooms grew emptier each week. People married, buried their dead, and argued about rumors. Some believed the Germans would withdraw. Others believed the Soviets would bypass the city entirely. Many believed nothing at all, which was easier. Evacuation was discussed, then quietly abandoned. Officially, there was no plan to move civilians out of Budapest. Unofficially, leaving was discouraged, then forbidden. Roads were restricted. Trains were commandeered for military use. Permits became impossible to obtain. And looming over every decision was a single word that spread from headquarters to street corners: Festung, fortress. In Hitler's strategic thinking, cities were no longer places to protect. They were obstacles to be weaponized. If the enemy wanted Budapest, they would have to bleed for it. The population was not a liability. It was a shield. By late November, German engineers began preparing the city for destruction. Bridges across the Danube were wired with explosives. Defensive positions were dug into parks, cemeteries, and courtyards. Apartment buildings were converted into firing points. Anti-tank guns appeared at street intersections like permanent sentries. Civilians watched this transformation from their windows. They saw sandbags stacked where children once played. They saw soldiers sleeping in stairwells, boots still on, rifles within reach. They heard the language of finality in officers' voices. No talk of retreat, only of holding to the last man. But still, no evacuation order came. For families with means, there was a brief window in October and early November when leaving was possible through unofficial routes. Some bribed guards. Some fled west toward Austria. Many did not go, because elderly parents could not travel, because children were sick, because they believed Christmas would still be Christmas. For most, the decision was made for them. By December, Budapest was full of people who had not chosen to stay, but had simply run out of exits. Nearly 800,000 civilians remained inside the city limits when the Soviet encirclement began. Among them were tens of thousands of Jews who had survived the mass deportations earlier that year, either because of foreign protective papers, hidden apartments, or sheer luck. They were living on borrowed time in a city that was rapidly turning hostile to the idea of mercy. The Arrow Cross used that time efficiently. Their patrols intensified as the front drew closer. Uniformed and semi-uniformed militiamen moved through neighborhoods with lists, knocking on doors after dark. People disappeared overnight. Entire apartment buildings learned to sleep without undressing, in case boots stopped outside their door. By December 1944, executions along the Danube had become a routine act of terror. The river, wide and indifferent, served as both killing ground and grave. Residents living nearby learned to avoid the embankments. Fishermen stopped fishing. Parents told children the water was cursed. But nothing in the city's recent memory prepared people for what would happen when the siege closed. On December 23rd, rumors raced through Budapest faster than any official announcement. Soviet units had reached the outskirts. The ring was tightening. Some claimed there would be a ceasefire for Christmas. Others insisted the Germans would counterattack and break the encirclement within days. That night, families debated whether to go to church the next evening, whether it was safer above ground or below, whether candles should be saved or burned now, while there was still electricity. At dawn on December 24th, the last illusion collapsed. Soviet forces completed the encirclement from the north and south. Roads fell silent. Couriers stopped arriving. The city exhaled and did not inhale again. Budapest was alone. German commanders inside the city immediately imposed strict controls. Movement between districts was limited. Civilians were ordered to clear streets for military traffic. Buildings were requisitioned without notice. Food stocks were inventoried and, in many cases, seized. The population understood the message without it being spoken aloud. You are now part of the defense. There would be no evacuation corridors, no humanitarian pause, no holiday exception. For the Arrow Cross, the siege created both chaos and opportunity. With German authority focused on military survival, local fascists acted with increasing autonomy. They intensified their hunt, particularly in Pest, dragging people from shelters under the pretext of security checks. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day became ideal cover. Families gathered. People revealed themselves. Routines made them predictable. In some neighborhoods, residents heard singing from nearby churches, while gunshots echoed from the riverbanks. The contradiction was unbearable. Inside apartments, people began to destroy documents, burning letters, tearing photographs, hiding names that could be used against them. Jewish families debated whether to flee to basements or risk remaining upstairs. Some believed the siege might protect them, that the chaos would slow the killers. They were wrong. As night fell on December 24th, artillery fire intensified. Windows shattered across the city. Fires broke out in industrial districts. Ambulances stopped responding. The city's infrastructure, already fragile, began to collapse under pressure. And still, there was no order to leave. In the western districts of Buda, where hills offered some natural shelter, families crowded into wine cellars and caves dug centuries earlier. In Pest, where buildings stood closer together, people retreated into basements and underground corridors, turning storage rooms into living spaces. Above ground, the city belonged to soldiers. Christmas arrived not with bells, but with the sound of boots on frozen pavement. For Budapest civilians, the realization came slowly, then all at once. They were no longer waiting for the war to pass through. The war had chosen to stay. The city that had not been allowed to leave would now be forced to endure everything that followed: hunger, disease, fear, and a violence that did not recognize holy days. And this was only the beginning. The siege did not announce itself with a single decisive blow. It arrived the way winter does, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. On the morning of December 25th, 1944, Budapest woke to a city that no longer moved. Trams stood abandoned on their tracks, power lines sagged, and streets that had once pulsed with weekday noise were eerily still. It was not silence in the peaceful sense. It was the silence of something holding its breath. Then the artillery resumed. From the hills north of Buda and the flatlands beyond Pest, Soviet guns began to work methodically. This was not indiscriminate shelling. It was deliberate pressure, aimed at rail yards, crossroads, communication hubs, and German strongpoints. Each explosion peeled another layer away from the illusion that the city might somehow survive intact. German commanders inside Budapest understood the situation immediately. They had expected an encirclement, but not so swiftly, not so completely. Radio messages sent west were short and increasingly desperate. Requests for air supply followed. Promises of relief columns were repeated like prayers. None of them came true. Inside the city, the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS reorganized. Units were redeployed from outer districts into tighter defensive sectors. Hungarian forces, many exhausted and poorly equipped, were ordered to hold positions that no longer made strategic sense. Desertion increased, punishable by summary execution. Civilians watched soldiers dig in closer to their homes. Machine gun nests appeared in apartment windows. Anti-tank obstacles were dragged into streets by forced laborers. The city's parks, once places of leisure, were torn apart for trenches. Graves were dug not for the dead, but for the living who knew they would soon need them. Food began to disappear. At first, shortages were subtle. Bakeries closed temporarily. Milk deliveries stopped. Then ration cards were reduced again and again. Meat vanished entirely. Horses pulling carts through the streets were eyed, not with pity, but calculation. Water became unreliable. Bombardments shattered pipes, flooding some basements while leaving entire neighborhoods dry. People queued for hours at public wells, listening for the whistle of incoming shells, learning when to drop to the ground and when to run. Hospitals overflowed within days. Christmas Day should have been quiet. Instead, it became the first full day of urban siege warfare. Civilians were caught in crossfire as snipers claimed rooftops and upper floors. Streets became corridors of death. Crossing an intersection could mean not coming back. In Pest, the flat terrain offered little protection. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble in a matter of days. Families fled from one basement to another, carrying what they could in their arms. Children learned not to cry. Adults learned not to look back. In Buda, the hills provided cover, but also targets. Soviet observers could see German positions clearly. Shells rained down with punishing accuracy. Historic buildings burned. Churches lost their roofs. Statues were shattered mid-prayer. As the days passed, the sense of time collapsed. People stopped marking dates. Christmas blurred into ordinary terror. New Year's Eve approached unnoticed. What mattered was daylight and darkness, shelling and pauses, survival and loss. And beneath all of it ran a darker current. The Arrow Cross did not stop. If anything, the siege emboldened them. With German command focused on the military catastrophe unfolding, local fascist units operated with increased autonomy. They claimed to be maintaining internal security. In reality, they used the chaos to finish what had begun months earlier. Night raids intensified. Militiamen moved through Jewish neighborhoods, through safe houses and protected buildings, ripping foreign passports from hands. tearing down Swedish and Swiss flags that marked diplomatic protection. They dragged people out into the streets under cover of darkness, telling neighbors it was just questioning. Everyone knew what that meant. The Danube became a killing ground once more. Witnesses later described the sound of gunfire echoing off the water, muffled by fog and snow. They described how shoes piled up on the embankment, neat, almost respectful, as if order could disguise murder. They described how the river carried bodies away, making counting impossible. Christmas week was particularly lethal. Families gathered out of habit, not hope. That made them easy to find. In some cases, entire households were taken. In others, a single person was dragged away while the rest were forced to watch, knowing intervention meant joining them. The city learned to shut its windows at night. By the end of December, Budapest was no longer functioning as a city. It was a collection of hiding places connected by danger. The dead lay where they fell. Burials were improvised. Shallow graves in courtyards, cellars turned into tombs. Disease followed hunger. Typhus spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters. Lice became a constant presence. Medical supplies were exhausted. Doctors amputated limbs without anesthesia. Nurses reused bandages until they fell apart. Still, the fighting intensified. German attempts to break out were discussed, but never authorized. Orders from Berlin remained unchanged. Hold the city at all costs. The phrase "last man" appeared in messages so often that it lost meaning. For civilians, that phrase translated simply, "We are expendable." On December 29th, Soviet forces captured the outer suburbs completely. The ring tightened. Artillery moved closer. The shelling grew heavier, less patient. The city burned in places that had never known fire before. Yet in some basements, candles were still lit at night. Not out of faith exactly, but defiance. A refusal to let darkness claim everything. People whispered prayers, recited poems, told children stories of summers that felt impossibly distant. They did not know how long the siege would last. They did not know how bad it would become. But by the final days of December 1944, one truth was unavoidable. Budapest was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for endurance. And endurance, in a besieged city, is measured not in days, but in lives. The Danube did not care what day it was. It flowed as it always had, wide, dark, and patient, cutting Budapest in two, carrying barges in peacetime, carrying history in silence. In December 1944, it carried something else: death. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, executions along the river had already become a grim routine. But the siege changed the rhythm. The chaos of encirclement, the confusion of authority, and the certainty that no one was leaving the city created the conditions for something colder and more deliberate. The men of the Arrow Cross Party understood this instinctively. They knew the city was trapped. They knew witnesses had nowhere to run. And they knew that Christmas, of all nights, would make people visible. Families gathered, doors opened, candles burned in windows. The city revealed itself. So did its victims. On the evening of December 24th, 1944, Arrow Cross units moved through Pest with renewed purpose. They wore green armbands with the crossed arrow symbol. Some carried lists. Others relied on memory. They knocked on doors with rifles, shouting orders that allowed no delay. Get dressed. Bring your papers. Quickly, foreign protective documents, Swedish, Swiss, Vatican, were often ignored or torn apart on the spot. Diplomatic immunity meant nothing once the city was sealed. The law had collapsed into ideology. People were marched through streets dimly lit by blackout conditions and distant fires. Those who stumbled were beaten. Those who resisted were shot where they stood. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, learning the limits of their own courage. The destination was always the same: the river. At the embankment, the routine was brutally efficient. Victims were ordered to remove their shoes. Leather was valuable even now. Hands were tied. often in groups of 3 or 4, because it saved ammunition. One bullet could pull several bodies into the water. Witnesses later recalled the sound most vividly. Not the shots, but the silence before them. The way the city seemed to pause, as if even the buildings understood what was about to happen. Then the gunfire. Bodies fell forward. Some screamed, some didn't. The river accepted them all. The current erased evidence faster than any order ever could. Christmas night was bitterly cold, but not cold enough to freeze the Danube. Snow fell intermittently, clinging to coats, dissolving into the water. The banks grew slick with ice and blood. This was not a spontaneous atrocity. It was organized murder carried out under cover of a holiday. The Arrow Cross understood symbolism. They used it deliberately. Christmas, with its language of purity and rebirth, became a stage for ideological cleansing. Killing on that night was not an accident. It was a message. Budapest was being purified. Inside the city, rumors spread quickly. People whispered about the river, about shoes piling up along the embankment, about bodies washing ashore downstream. Some claimed the Danube itself had turned red. Others said it moaned at night. Fear became geographic. Certain streets were avoided. Certain hours were feared. Parents warned children never to go near the water. But fear could not protect everyone. In some cases, Arrow Cross units raided protected houses, buildings marked with foreign flags that were supposed to shelter Jews under diplomatic immunity. Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg had issued thousands of protective passes earlier that year, saving countless lives. But by December, his authority was being openly challenged. Militiamen stormed these buildings anyway, dragging people out while guards looked away, or were powerless to intervene. Some residents tried to hide in attics, crawl spaces, behind false walls. Some succeeded. Many did not. Christmas Day passed in fragments. In churches, Mass was abbreviated, conducted under threat of shelling. Priests spoke of hope to congregations that no longer recognized the word. In basements, families shared whatever food remained, a boiled potato, a piece of bread, pretending it was a feast. Outside, the killings continued. Not every execution happened at the river. Some took place in courtyards, in stairwells, in the streets themselves. The siege provided cover for private brutality. Scores settled, grudges enforced, cruelty unleashed without consequence. The line between war and murder disappeared. The German military presence did not stop the Arrow Cross. In some cases, officers intervened, not out of compassion, but concern for order. In others, they did nothing. The city's hierarchy had fractured. Authority no longer flowed downward. It shattered and reformed around violence. By December 26th, the number of dead could no longer be estimated. Bodies lay frozen in alleyways. Others were buried hastily under rubble. Many were simply gone, carried away by the river, absorbed into its anonymity. The Danube became a boundary not just between Buda and Pest, but between life and disappearance. For those still alive, survival required invisibility. People learned to erase themselves. No lights, no noise, no movement. Families rotated watch shifts at night, listening for footsteps on stairs, for knocks on doors, for the unmistakable click of rifle safeties. Children were trained to stay silent, even when afraid. Crying could get everyone killed. The city's Jewish population, reduced and traumatized, lived in constant motion, moving from shelter to shelter, relying on strangers, trusting and mistrusting in equal measure. Every decision was a gamble with irreversible stakes. Christmas ended without ceremony. There was no announcement that it was over, no signal that the killing would stop. It simply bled into the next day, and the next, until the holiday lost all meaning. What remained was the memory of that contrast. Candles burning in windows above streets where people were dragged to their deaths. Carols sung softly in basements, while gunshots echoed by the river. A celebration of birth overshadowed by systematic extinction. Later, survivors would struggle to describe that night. Some would say it was the coldest Christmas they had ever known. Others would say it was the longest. Many would say it was the moment they stopped believing that anything, faith, tradition, civilization, had the power to restrain human cruelty. Budapest did not call it Bloody Christmas at the time. That name came later, after the siege, after the counting, after the graves. But for those who stood by the Danube in December 1944, watching the river carry away their neighbors, the truth was immediate and unmistakable. Christmas had not saved them, and the river remembered everything. By the last days of December 1944, Budapest had moved below the surface. What remained above ground belonged to soldiers, rubble, and death. The living retreated downward, into basements, wine cellars, storage rooms, drainage tunnels, and any space that offered even the illusion of protection. The city became layered, war on top, survival underneath. These underground worlds were never meant to hold people. Cellars built to store coal or wine now held entire families. Dozens of strangers shared rooms without ventilation, without light, without privacy. Air grew thick with smoke, sweat, fear, and the sickly sweetness of decay from wounds that could not be treated properly. Lice spread quickly. Coughs echoed and could not be silenced. Yet this was where Christmas was spent. In one cellar on the pest side, a former schoolteacher arranged 3 candles on an overturned crate and told the children it was an altar. In another, a woman wrapped a piece of thread around a bent nail and hung it like an ornament, insisting that tradition still mattered. Some people whispered carols, not because they believed, but because the melodies were familiar, and familiarity was a form of resistance. Others refused to mark the day at all. For them, Christmas had become dangerous. It reminded them of what had been taken, of who was missing, of the sounds coming from the river. They chose silence instead. Above these shelters, the city was being dismantled piece by piece. Artillery fire intensified as Soviet units probed deeper into defensive lines. German and Hungarian forces fought from buildings, turning stairwells into kill zones and apartments into fortresses. Every floor was contested. Walls were blown open to create internal passageways. Entire blocks became single, interconnected battlefields. Civilians learned the rules quickly. Never light a fire during shelling. Never run in the open. Never trust that a familiar street is still safe. Moving from one shelter to another required timing. Short dashes during lulls, hugging walls, memorizing routes that changed daily as buildings collapsed. Many did not make it. Those who were wounded often died quietly underground. There were no funerals. Bodies were wrapped in blankets and placed in corners until they could be buried, if burial was possible at all. Sometimes they remained there for weeks, because leaving the cellar meant risking everyone else. The living learned to coexist with the dead. In some shelters, religious rituals continued in fragments. Priests and rabbis alike moved between cellars, offering whispered prayers, final blessings, moments of human contact. They did not promise salvation. They promised presence. Hospitals, overwhelmed and undersupplied, moved operations underground as well. Surgical tables were set up in basements. Amputations were performed by candlelight. Screams were muffled with cloth. Morphine ran out early. Alcohol took its place. Doctors recorded cases on scraps of paper that would later be lost. Names blurred together. Survival became statistical. Outside, winter deepened. Snow covered ruins, giving the city a deceptive stillness. From a distance, Budapest looked almost peaceful. White rooftops, quiet streets, no traffic. From within, it was a city suffocating under pressure. The siege compressed everything: time, space, morality. Food became the central obsession. People boiled leather, scraped mold from bread, ate cats, dogs, rats. Horses killed by shelling were butchered where they fell. Nothing was wasted. Hunger stripped away shame quickly. Children aged visibly in weeks. Parents aged in days. New Year's Eve passed without celebration. There were no fireworks, only artillery flashes. Some mistook them for a cruel parody of celebration. Others no longer bothered to look up. As January approached, the cold grew harsher. Heating systems had long since failed. People burned furniture, books, anything flammable. Libraries disappeared one volume at a time. Family photographs fed fires. History became fuel. In this underground existence, news arrived distorted and delayed. Rumors claimed relief was coming, that German forces would break through, that the Soviets would allow evacuation, that the worst was over. None of it was true. The city was tightening inward, and so were its people. Trust became fragile. Strangers were watched carefully. Any noise could draw attention. Any mistake could be fatal. Survival required cooperation, but fear undermined it constantly. And still, above ground, the killing did not stop. The Arrow Cross continued its work whenever it could, dragging people from shelters, accusing them of collaboration, treason, impurity. Some executions happened so close to hiding places that those underground could hear the shots clearly, counting them, wondering who was gone now. Christmas faded into memory. What remained was endurance, measured in breaths, in hours, in nights survived. Budapest was no longer a city waiting to be saved. It was a city learning how to endure the unimaginable. And endurance, as its people were discovering, did not come with dignity. It came with scars. Hunger did not arrive in Budapest suddenly. It crept in quietly, disguising itself as inconvenience before revealing its true face. At first, people spoke of shortages, then of rationing, then of improvisation. By January 1945, no one used polite words anymore. The city was starving. Official food reserves had been calculated for a much shorter defense. German planners had assumed either relief or collapse within weeks. Neither happened. As the siege dragged on, warehouses emptied, supply drops failed, and distribution systems collapsed entirely. What remained was scavenging. Families dismantled their homes piece by piece. Wallpaper was boiled for the glue. Leather belts were cut into strips and cooked until soft enough to chew. Sawdust was mixed into flour to stretch bread that barely resembled food. Anything organic became a potential meal. Animals vanished from the streets. First the horses, killed by shelling, then deliberately slaughtered. Their meat was tough, often contaminated, but it kept people alive. Then dogs, then cats, then rats. People stopped asking where the meat came from. Questions were a luxury. Children grew hollow-eyed. Mothers measured food in crumbs, breaking pieces smaller and smaller, pretending not to be hungry themselves. Fathers ventured out at night to search ruined buildings, risking snipers and patrols for a sack of grain or a frozen potato buried under rubble. Many never returned. The markets that still functioned operated by barter. A wedding ring could buy a loaf of bread. A silk dress could buy soup. Gold lost its meaning quickly. Calories became the only currency that mattered. Hunger reshaped morality. People stole from neighbors they had known for years. They lied. They hid food from the sick. They learned to turn away from pleading eyes. Survival demanded it. Disease followed close behind. Typhus spread rapidly through overcrowded shelters. Dysentery became common as water sources were contaminated. Without medicine, minor infections turned fatal. Doctors could diagnose but rarely treat. Hospitals became places where people went to die. Medical staff worked until collapse, often surviving on the same starvation rations as their patients. They reused bandages until they disintegrated. Instruments were boiled repeatedly. Operations were performed without anesthesia. Patients bit down on belts, on wood, on nothing at all. Outside, the fighting intensified. By mid-January, Soviet forces had pushed deep into Pest. Street battles raged day and night. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Civilians caught in the open were shot without warning. There was no distinction between combat zone and living space. Every doorway was a risk, every window a target. The Danube bridges were blown one by one. First, Margaret Bridge, partially destroyed in a premature explosion. Then, systematically, the others. The river became a wider divide, not just between Buda and Pest, but between phases of the city's death. When the last bridge fell, escape became physically impossible. Budapest was severed. On the Pest side, Soviet troops advanced relentlessly. On the Buda Hills, German and Hungarian forces prepared for a last stand. Civilians were trapped in between, moving with the front line whether they wanted to or not. Many sought shelter in caves and tunnels carved into the hillsides, natural fortresses that now housed the starving and the wounded. There, in darkness, people waited out bombardments, counting explosions, listening to the earth shake. Some lost their minds. Starvation eroded not only bodies, but thought itself. People forgot names, forgot dates, forgot why the war had begun. The future shrank to the next meal, the next hour, the next night survived. Death became ordinary. Bodies lay unburied because burial required strength no one had left. In some shelters, the dead were stacked outside until shelling eased. In others, they were simply left where they fell, covered with a blanket, becoming part of the space. By late January, the smell of decay hung over entire districts. Yet still, the orders from Berlin did not change. No surrender, no evacuation, no mercy. German commanders planned desperate breakout attempts, fully aware that civilians would be left behind. Soldiers prepared to abandon wounded comrades who could not move. Loyalty was measured in obedience, not humanity. On January 18, 1945, Soviet forces fully captured Pest. The city was split, its eastern half fallen, its western half still fighting. Civilians crossed the frozen river where bridges once stood, risking sniper fire to flee the ruins. Some made it. Many were killed mid-crossing, their bodies collapsing onto ice that cracked beneath them. Those who reached Buda brought stories of total devastation. They spoke of streets filled with corpses, of silence broken only by gunfire, of hunger so deep it no longer hurt. It simply consumed. Budapest was no longer recognizable. It had become an experiment in endurance pushed beyond human limits. And still, the fighting continued. The city starved not because there was no food left in the world, but because ideology demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice was cheapest when it was not the leaders who paid it. By the end of January, survival itself felt like an act of defiance. But defiance had a cost, and the city would soon pay it in full. By February 1945, Budapest was no longer a city in the conventional sense. It was a wound that refused to close. The defenders in Buda knew the end was coming. Soviet forces tightened their grip with relentless precision, advancing through ruined streets, climbing shattered staircases, clearing cellars one by one. Every day brought fewer options, fewer bullets, fewer men capable of standing. Inside the German command structure, desperation finally replaced illusion. Plans for a breakout, once whispered, then argued, then postponed, were now unavoidable. Staying meant annihilation. Surrender was forbidden. The only remaining path was escape through enemy lines, westward, under cover of darkness. The civilians were not told. On the night of February 11, 1945, approximately 28,000 German and Hungarian soldiers attempted a coordinated breakout from the Buda Hills. It was a last gamble, launched without regard for those still sheltering beneath them. The city erupted. Soviet artillery detected the movement almost immediately. Machine gun fire cut through the night. Searchlights swept across snow-covered slopes, illuminating fleeing figures like targets on a range. Mortars fell in waves. The hills became killing fields. Very few made it through. By morning, the ground was littered with bodies. Soldiers, frozen mid-stride, weapons still clutched in their hands. The wounded were left where they fell. Those captured were marched east. The illusion of a final escape died with them. Inside the city, civilians woke to a different kind of silence. Not peace, but exhaustion. The defenders were gone. On February 13, 1945, the remaining German and Hungarian forces in Buda surrendered. The Siege of Budapest was over after 102 days of continuous fighting. What remained was devastation on a scale few European capitals had endured. More than 38,000 civilians were dead. Tens of thousands more were wounded, displaced, or orphaned. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Every bridge across the Danube lay destroyed, their twisted metal submerged like broken bones beneath the water. The city's Jewish population had been decimated. Those who survived emerged from hiding skeletal, traumatized, unsure whether survival itself was a blessing or a burden. The Danube continued to flow. In the weeks after liberation, bodies surfaced along its banks, some recently killed, others carried from upstream, some impossible to identify. Shoes still washed ashore, mute evidence of what had happened there. Budapest began the slow process of counting the uncountable. Mass graves were uncovered. Lists of the missing were written, rewritten, abandoned. Survivors searched for familiar faces among the living and the dead, often finding neither. Liberation did not bring relief so much as shock. For many, the fear did not end with the fighting. The transition from siege to occupation was abrupt and disorienting. Trust had been destroyed too thoroughly to be restored quickly. Hunger lingered, disease lingered, grief lingered longest of all. People returned to streets they no longer recognized, to homes that no longer existed, to lives that could not be rebuilt as they were. And Christmas, the memory of it, remained stained. The phrase, "Bloody Christmas," was never official. No government decree named it. No monument marks December 24th as a singular day of mourning. And yet, among survivors, the memory endured. It endured because that Christmas stripped away the last illusion, that war might still obey boundaries, that tradition, faith, or season could restrain violence, that there were days when killing would pause. In Budapest, Christmas did not stop the siege. It did not stop the executions. It did not stop the hunger, the fear, or the river from carrying away the dead. Instead, it revealed something darker. That human cruelty does not need permission from history. That it can coexist with candles, carols, and prayer. That civilization is thinner than it appears. For those who lived through it, Christmas was never the same again. Some never celebrated it. Some celebrated quietly. Some taught their children what happened. Others could not speak of it at all. Budapest rebuilt itself in the decades that followed. Bridges rose again. Streets filled with life. Cafes reopened. Music returned. But beneath the city, in basements and cellars, in the memory of the river, something remained. A knowledge passed down without ceremony. That once, on a Christmas when the world expected peace, a city learned what it meant to be abandoned by mercy. And that is why, long after the guns fell silent, Budapest remembered Christmas 1944 not as a holiday, but as a warning.